joy and passion. And in some ways, to begin by showing a very personal image, I hope you can see this, the picture of my husband and son standing out in front of our house in Toronto with my son dressed up for Halloween as one of the great pyramids of Giza. You can see his little hands and his face coming out. And I like to show this by saying, as a way of saying that when you are the child of an architectural historian, no one gets out alive. You know, every year he has to be a different architectural monument. Until recently he said to me, he's like, Mom, can't I just be like the other kids and go like Darth Vader? I'm like, no. You know, so we've been Hagia Sophia, the Empire State Building. But they're always a great production. And I show this partly by saying that my passion has become, for better or for worse, his passion. Maybe I'm just making sure he has something to talk to his therapist about in 20 years, which may well be true. But it's also to really begin to explain that what I do, which is the study primarily of Renaissance architecture from the 15th and 16th centuries, could not be more of an arcane subject, a subject that you might say has no relevance. In contrast to the previous speakers who were thinking about very real sort of concerns in the world, that what I do can often feel to have no relevance or concern in the world. And in part, that's because the buildings that I work on most often are the buildings of the 1%. What I'm teaching are the Medici palaces in Florence, the architecture of the rich and famous, the powerful. Partly that is a condition of what survives. These are the extraordinary buildings that have lasted down through time. It's also a condition of what we tend to value, that we tend to value these kinds of elitist architectures, these architectures that have such a sort of prominence in the world. And if what I'm doing in the classroom, in my writing, is talking about this elite culture, what is the value of it? What is the passion that I'm trying to carry forward to my students? On a bad day, I might say that what I'm doing is producing very, very well-educated tourists. And I sort of say to students, you will thank me when I hope you all have the chance to travel and go see things, and when you are on the hill overlooking the city of Florence, you will be able to talk about how that dome of the Santa Maria del Fiore was built. But it's really, I hope to say, a little bit more than that, because what I'm trying to do is to bring a kind of set of values, a set of ideas that people can carry forward. Now, this idea about the values of architecture really begins from the very first ideas that we have about where architecture began and what people from a long time ago believed where architecture came from. The ancient Roman writer Vitruvius told a story about architecture. And he said that architecture began when we gathered around fire. And that's what this Renaissance print shows, a great fire in the background and people and families coming together around that fire. And in order to make shelter, in order to keep the rain off of their backs, they put twigs together. They had branches that leaned against one another, and they covered them with trees. And those were the first houses, when people settled, were no longer nomadic, living in one place. But Vitruvius goes on to say that if those were the origins of architecture, if that's where architecture started from, or coming together in communities, it didn't stay like that. He said because one group of people would go and look at the houses of another group of people and say, they built their houses better than we built our houses. It's kind of, one can see it in very modern terms as kind of keeping up with the Joneses. Sort of, what are they building, up in the north part of Toronto versus what are we building downtown? And that idea, that comparison, story Vitruvius says, is what gets us to build differently. We're constantly improving. We're constantly trying to build not just better houses than our neighbors, but to try to make our houses and our buildings represent more of what we are, of who we are to the outside world. And so right from this very start, Vitruvius has this lovely idea that architecture is not just a reflection of who we are, but it actually projects us into the world. In other words, it's our aspirations as well as our beliefs at this very moment. So there's this sense of time in architecture. Still exists now for 13 poor men and women who still live there. It is from the early 15th century an extraordinary example of housing for the elderly in the 15th century, a kind of sort of humane, civilized building of community that is not the one architecture of the 1%. So these changes that happen in the Renaissance allow students to see how social reforms, changes in groups of people can result in new kinds of architecture. And so many of the kinds of buildings that we connect with institutions now, schools, housing complexes, planned housing complexes, hospitals. This is an extraordinary hospital in France called the Hôtel de Dieu in Beaune, which was again built by a nobleman in his hometown. And you can see the hospital beds lining the wall. It was used for a hospital until the 1940s. All the beds facing towards the chapel at the end of the building, at the end of this great tall hall. That this kind of new architecture responded to these great social changes. But in sort of my last quarter of my talk, I want to sort of bring up what I think is even the larger issue that I'm trying to get students to understand. And that's the question of wonder. Because what I'm showing them are things which are, in fact, very far from their everyday life. They're kinds of buildings, they're kinds of ornamentation, they may be in places they don't know anything about. And if I can, in fact, have that, I don't understand, I don't know what it is, why does this mean something to me, be a central part of my presentation to them, then I can elicit, I can trigger in them this idea of wonder. Wonder is the motivation that gets us to learn. We learn things because we don't know what they are. We ask questions. Aristotle, Descartes said that all learning begins from wonder. So that is my goal, is in fact to get them to think about things that they don't know. And in this case, the other tool, the other way that I have in, which is the way that we get everyone to pay attention, is to talk about passion and sex. Because passion and sex were very much a part of the discussions of Renaissance architecture. I have them read a little snippet from a great passionate novel of the 15th century called the Hypnerotomachia Polyphily, which means the strife of love in a dream. And it's the story of a young monk who falls in love with a young nun. And you see them embracing here. And he pursues her through 500 pages of extraordinary florid text. And he goes, he meets dragons, and finally he embraces her and they consummate their relationship in a circular temple. And so nothing gets the students more excited than reading a passionate novel about sex and architecture. And I tell them about how the early architects, when they were envisioning a building, would look to a column. And in that column, the Ionic column, the order associated with young women, they would see a naked young woman when they designed. And I said, this is the foundation of modern architectural design and passion. So I absolutely appeal to their basest instincts. But I get them to see that what they're looking at is a world which may not be exactly similar to them, but it's a world that raises all sorts of questions about who we are, how we live in the world, how we shape the spaces around us, and how especially architecture, in ways that sometimes we can't even articulate. Architecture stimulates our passions, it gets us excited, it shapes the way we live in the world. And as I end here with a picture of a few years ago when I took a group of students to Venice to look at architecture. I mean, nothing, and so they're sitting here while some students are lecturing to their colleagues on the steps of the Palladian Church, the Redentore in Venice, that this is really what I'm trying to teach to students, to teach them about a kind of passionate understanding of architecture, a passionate way to look at the world around them. Because whether or not they become architects, it really doesn't matter. They are going to be the people who make the decisions in town councils. They are going to be the consumers of architecture and shape the world that we all live in. Thank you very much.